I've rough milled the 4 legs and all the stretchers and the entire leg assembly, and now I'm trimming the curved laminated front stretchers to length. I've rigged up my sliding compound miter saw with a stop block to keep the fence parallel, or excuse me, keep the piece, the axis of the piece, parallel to the fence. And now it's just a matter of trimming this to exact length. We're cutting tenons into the curved stretcher, and I'm using a tenoning jig with the table saw to cut the cheeks of the tenons. You can see I've made a wedge that fits along my tenoning jig to keep the work at the proper angle. I've adjusted the saw to the correct height, and I very carefully adjusted the lateral movement of the tenoning jig so that the saw will make contact right on my line. I'll do that for each side of the tenon on both stretcher pieces, and that will be the completion of the cheek cuts. Now I've got the cheeks cut. The next step is to cut the tenons to the correct width, and to do that I've taken my wedge and rotated it from this face to the back support and placed my work in and clamped it down, and I'm going to go ahead and just cut the thickness, the width of the tenons. The cheeks are cut, the tenons are cut to the right width, and now I've got to cut the shoulders of the tenons. Now I could make some jigs and use power tools to do this, but I think in this case it's faster and maybe a little more accurate to use hand tools. So the first thing I did was take my sharp marking knife, and using some straight edges I went ahead and marked where the cuts need to be to cut off the waist and expose the shoulders. I'll be using my Japanese pull saw, very fine tooth, very straight, to cut the waist off. And then later on I'll come back and just using a chisel just trim up and make a perfect fit. And here's the final tenons rough cut. You get an idea now of what I mean about having the tenons on the end of a curved piece. And I'm going to hold off on final paring of the shoulders with chisels until I have the mortises cut in the legs, and then I can make the fit perfect. Cutting the cheeks and the thickness or the width of this tenon on the straight piece was very straightforward, quick operation with the tenoning jig. Now I'm also going to do a quick operation where I'll cut the waist off using a cross-cut sled. I set the blade height so that it cuts off exactly the amount of waist, and you can see I've already done one side. And I've set a stop block here to give me the correct depth. I'll just run that through the saw and cut the waist off. And there we are, a pair of tenons on the end of the rear stretchers, the straight stretchers. And notice I won't have to do any trimming, paring with a chisel because cutting these on the crosscut sled
made the shoulders pretty much perfect. And I think this is a good demonstration of why curved work is so much more difficult and time-consuming than straight work. I did this entire pair of straight piece tenons in less than an hour. That included all the layout, whereas the curved work took me several hours.
The three boxes that make up the carcass of the sideboard buffet are supported by the stretchers that go between the legs, and we've already put the tenons on the end of those stretchers. However, the boxes are actually supported by another set of shorter stretchers that go fore and aft between the long stretchers. There's a total of 4 sets of these, and they're all connected to the long stretchers with double mortise and tenons that go through the stretchers. So I'm going to use my tenoning jig to cut the cheeks of those double tenons on the end of each of these short stretchers. And to make sure that they all are identical, I've ganged up the 4 short stretchers that get those particular tenons, and I'm going to cut them at one time. I've cut the cheeks for the double tenons on the short stretcher pieces, and you can see here one tenon, another tenon. Now I've got to cut off the waist on each side to form the shoulders. I'm using a miter gauge. I've got a piece of wood attached to the miter gauge with some sandpaper on it and a stop block. That way the work stays nice and firm along here as I run it through the saw, and I've got the saw blade to the correct height to cut off just the waist piece. And once I've made that cut, a little trimming with a hand saw to get the angle right, and we'll be all done. I've got the tenons for the short stretchers cut. You can see they're double tenons on each end. The front tenon has an angle on it because the stretcher is curved, and so this has to fit that curve approximately. The back shoulders are square because the back stretcher is straight. So here's the tricky part. It's cutting the mortises into the curved stretcher. The mortises are what the tenons will fit into. You can see the curved stretcher here. The tenon will come, or the short stretcher will come up from behind, and it needs to go through 2 through mortises that come all the way through. So these have to be straight down into this curved piece. So I made this jig. This jig here holds the curved stretcher, lots of clamps, clamped to the table of my 1951 Shopsmith. And all of this is clamped to a mortising jig that I built 30 years ago, I guess. And it slides back and forth while a 2-flute end mill bit turns. And as I lower the end mill, so you can see that, into the work, I'll go back and forth until I've cut the mortise. I finished cutting all the mortises into the stretchers. Here's one of the curved stretchers, and you can see that the mortise ends up being rounded on each end because the mill bit that cuts them is rotating. And so I debated on whether to leave the mortises rounded and make the tenons on the end of the short stretchers rounded, or keep the tenons squared and square off the mortises. And I decided to keep the tenons squared because it gives a little more strength to these pieces, which are, of course, holding up the carcasses in which things will be stored. So, in order to square off the mortises, I'm using a 90-degree chisel. It's a corner chisel. It's made for this exact purpose, and I'll simply use that chisel on these mortises and square off the corners.
Now I've got all the main cross stretchers, the short ones, tenoned into mortises in the curved front and the back straight stretchers. And this is a dry glue up, and I'm showing this because it's extremely important that these large tenons on the ends of the long stretchers line up perfectly in the vertical direction and in the horizontal direction, so that when they intersect into mortises in the legs will stand parallel and straight up and down. So I've made some small wedges that go behind these clamps and draw the large stretchers together nice and evenly into the short stretchers, just so I can make sure that this alignment of the large tenons on the end of the long stretchers is perfect. A couple of other things I want to point out here is, one of the things you want to keep in mind in making a piece like this is grain orientation, and to have it pleasing. And you can see how I have made the grains on the back of the long stretchers and on the front of the long stretchers nice and harmonious, so that the finished piece, the grains will be complementing each other and not fighting each other. What I'm doing here is gluing up the center short stretchers so that the top and bottom stretcher are connected. If you look, you can see a block of wood between the top and bottom of those short stretchers. I've got that on the two center stretchers, not on the outside stretchers, just on the center. And the reason is to help tie together the top and bottom long stretchers so that there's extra strength in holding up the entire carcass assembly. You also notice a big long bar clamp going diagonally. That's just to make sure that the ends of these long tenons are perfectly in alignment as the glue sets.